Hi, I'm Whitney Espick, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the MIT Forum for Equity. I am Whitney Espick, CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I'm honored to moderate today's discussion. Today's broadcast is sponsored in part by the MIT Federal Credit Union, MIT Professional Education, and the MIT Mind, Hand, Heart Community Innovation Fund. I would like to extend a warm welcome, especially to members of the Wellesley and Harvard communities joining us for this special forum. We will welcome audience questions and input during this discussion. A reminder that conversations on climate and equity can be challenging, and we all benefit from active listening and respectful dialogue. For those joining us today, please use the Q&A feature found below the live stream to ask questions of our guest speakers. We will get to as many questions as we can. Our topic today is women's leadership in higher education. We'll aim to address some of the challenges and opportunities women are facing at the helm of colleges and universities, as well as in other leadership roles, and offer insights on other topics surrounding the climate of women on campus and beyond. Joining us are three women whose voices have been vital to this discussion: Drew Faust, President Emerita and Arthur Kingsley Porter University Professor at Harvard University and member of the MIT Corporation; Susan Hockfield, President Emerita of MIT, Professor of Neuroscience at MIT, and member of the Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research. She's also a member of the MIT Corporation. Paula Johnson, President of Wellesley College and co-chair of the 2018 National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine report on the sexual harassment of women. Welcome, Drew, Susan, and Paula. I'll just note that there have been many collaborations between our three campuses in the history of our institutions, friendships, business ventures, and not to mention marriages. And so we're happy that this moment continues that collaborative tradition. I'll start with an opening question. One statistic, 30%. That's the current percentage of all American colleges and universities led by women. The good news is that since the year 2000, that number has grown steadily. Of course, one statistic about higher ed leadership only goes so far in helping us understand the climate and inclusion challenges on many campuses that we have yet to fully address. Can you each start, and I'll call on you, by reflecting on that growth of women's leadership and the effect you think it is having on higher education, if any? We'll start with President Faust and President Emerita Faust, and then go to President Emerita Susan Hockfield, and then call on our current president, Paula Johnson at Wellesley, to add her thoughts. So Drew, if you would start out. And you're on mute still.
Thank you. Thank you, Whitney. Let me say what a pleasure it is to be with my fellow panelists. It's just great to see you and to be together, even if it is virtually. So Whitney, I think we should respond to your question first, or I should respond to your question first by saying, let's take a moment to acknowledge that this is remarkable progress. When I arrived at Harvard University in 2001 to be a dean and went to the regular dean's meetings with President Rudenstine, I was the only woman in those meetings. If you go to the Harvard homepage today and look up leadership, you'll see pictures of 15 deans of schools at Harvard, and 7 of them are women. And of those 7, 4 are African-American. This is a revolution in 20 years, and we should feel really good about that. But we should also recognize that it is only a first step and that we have a long way to go. And that in many fields within universities in particular, women still are in minuscule percentages, and in leadership positions in minuscule percentages. I know Susan will likely say something later on about the medical and scientific fields, but I saw a statistic recently that said in 2019 of medical school deans, 16% were women. So a very small percentage. And if we think about a field like economics, say if we move away from natural sciences, there have been a series of studies recently about discrimination against women in the economics field by the American Economics Association itself, by the National Bureau of Economic Research, how a culture of aggression in economics expresses itself particularly vehemently against women. So there is a great deal to be done. But you've also asked us, what difference does it make? And I just want to say one word about that before I stop. of course, if we want to have a broadest possible understanding and broadest possible attraction of talent, we want to include everybody. But I think there's one particular aspect of what's been happening with the commitment to diversity in higher education in recent years that makes it so imperative to have women's leadership. And that's the movement from focusing on diversity, which means numbers, 30% representation, get people in the door, to these other words that we now use along with diversity, inclusion and belonging. It's about a culture. It's not just about having people there. It's about having them thrive and feel that they're really part of that culture. And I think having women in leadership roles, women who have been in exclusionary cultures and themselves had knowledge of what it's like not to be included, not to feel like they belong. I think women have a particular motivation and maybe some insight into how we can broaden from diversity to include these broader understandings of what equity should mean.
Gosh, thank you for those thoughts, Drew. Susan, I wonder if you want to follow on and add some perspective.
Yeah, so I want to echo Drew, what a pleasure it is to be all together here, even though we are only virtual. Wish we could be together in person, but what a real privilege of all of these participants, and the numbers, of course, vastly exceeds anything we might have imagined if we were doing this in person and people actually had to travel. But it's fabulous to have a conversation with Drew and Paula. Whitney, thank you for moderating this. One of the things that's exciting for my generation, and my generation, I think, is Drew's generation, and Paul, I think, is a generation behind us, is having had the experience of being the only woman in the room. So many times it's just, delightful to be able to have conversations like this with women. Drew points out times have changed dramatically within our lifetimes, and Drew is, I think, reasonably modest about her experience, but when she joined Harvard, she was the dean of the Radcliffe Institute, which was the follow-on, the vestige of a completely, essentially separate way of educating women at Harvard, so they would not be entirely incorporated into, all of the activity, but still set aside. And when Radcliffe was more fully incorporated in Harvard, the Radcliffe Institute is the kind of the remaining activity that is obviously not exclusively for women. But I think in many cases, we have been token representatives as the first woman to do X or to do Y. The only woman in around many of these tables. One of the things that is just so welcome is that women in these positions is no longer the exception. It's not always the rule, but at least, I'm not always in a room where I'm the only woman any longer. Whitney, you start with the option that across higher education, 30% of these institutions are led by, but again, when you dig in a little deeper, it's not 30% across the board. So the American Council on Education has presented some data showing that it's, of course, 30% in some areas, but as one might expect, among doctoral institutions, women represent only 22% leadership, different from where, when there was essentially very little. I wouldn't, of course, because Hannah Gray at the University of Chicago kind of, in my mind, led the way in terms of, bringing women in university leadership. So we still have a way to go. And Drew has also pointed out that, it's discipline specific. So some disciplines have robustly opened their doors to women and minorities, and others, let's just say it's still a work in progress. Now, there is this other point that Drew called out, and I really want to emphasize it because the problem with being in the very small numbers is that there is a sense of that once you have named someone to this role, you've opened the possibility for women to join our campuses. Of course, when I joined the MIT as president in 2004, 2005, already the undergraduate population was 45% women. This was not known to the general world. When people learned that I was becoming, they said, but are there any women at MIT? And I would surprise them with this demonstration. There were already 45% women at MIT, but At the time, there was a woman dean of the School of Architecture, but deans and frankly, department heads as women were very rare. However, we need to work on changing what I call the network effects. So you can appoint women to positions, and that's important, and minorities also, but actually giving them access to the conversations where it really makes a difference is a very different order of business. And I'll come back to this later. I think our campuses have done a very good job of changing very dramatically. I still remember in the mid 1990s when Nancy Hopkins led the women in the School of Science to produce a report demonstrating that while there were women on the faculty in the School of Science, almost uniformly, their salaries were lower, their lab space was smaller, the kind of support they got from the Institute and beyond was less, and really led a kind of focus on these issues that have, if not eliminated, certainly reduced those kinds of disparities. But nonetheless, when we look at data from across our institutions, there are, as Drew pointed out in economics, there are still, really quite dramatic disparities. So delighted with the progress. We've delighted to have had opportunities that would not have been open to my mother or grandmother. But I think this is an area of continued work that, let's just say, the three of us have labored at, and I think we'll continue to labor at.
Thank you, Susan, for that context from your chair at MIT and your observations of higher ed for a good while. I'd like to invite Paula into the conversation and see what she might add on this litany of optimism and happiness with progress, but also an awareness that there may yet be quite a bit to do.
Thanks, Whitney. And again, it's truly a pleasure to be here and to be with my colleagues, Drew and Susan. As you know, Wellesley's had a long, storied relationship with MIT that we just so value. So it's really wonderful to be here on many fronts. I do want to say, of course, women's leadership has made a difference in higher education. When I thought about it, I said, well, gee, I wonder if there are any studies on this. And I don't know of any, but we do know that having a diversity of voices, a diversity of experience at any table makes a difference, makes a very positive difference in terms of the conversation, the culture, and how we really lead our institutions. It makes a difference with regard to some of the areas that Drew and Susan were discussing with regard to not just the numbers, but this sense of how we create a culture of respect and a culture of inclusion, where we use the word flourish or belonging, but how whatever the word is that you use, I think these are much deeper levels of this idea of diversity that we are really advancing now in all of our institutions, that really takes this idea of diversity again to a new level. Now, what I would say is that, again, this issue of intersectionality is essential. And we have made significant progress with women, I would say. We've made some progress as we think about how that intersects with how gender intersects with, for example, race. We've not made as much progress. 5% of all college presidents are women of color, and 2.5% are Black women. And that does not break out those, and I'm not saying there's any lesser than, but it also does not break out those presidents who are presidents of historically Black colleges and universities. So those numbers are still extremely low. And it just says that we have real work to do to create the pipeline and to open up those opportunities. And that's our job. Our job as leaders is to open up those opportunities. And I know that both Drew and Susan have done that. I have very focused efforts on how we do that. And I think it's important both for our faculty and our faculty leadership positions, our staff leadership positions, but also, quite frankly, for our students. So both Drew and Susan discussed fields that are really underpopulated, that's a euphemism, by women. Wellesley is a women's college, so we have I think, a very special place and responsibility to advance these issues and to, I think, create a reality that pushes up against what the norm is. So our faculty are 52% women, and that holds true across some of the most male-dominated fields: economics, computer science, the physical sciences, and philosophy. Our most popular major for probably several generations at Wellesley has been economics. And computer science is now number 3. And philosophy, we've sent our students to some of the best philosophy PhD programs. We are the leading producer of women PhDs in STEM. Now, I don't think that that's just because we're a great school. I think it's because our students are seeing who they can be. And I think that that truly makes a tremendous difference. So again, I think that we are far from where we need to be, but I have renewed hope. And I think we'll probably get into the pandemic and some of the impacts of the pandemic and what that has brought to light, both the negative and the positive, that we are on a very important road moving forward.
So 3 tremendously eloquent and inspiring assessments of what is possible on campus today, what is happening on campus today, and the direction that we can and should be heading. I want to open up our conversation a little bit to the outside world. I'm pretty confident that our many alumni guests will have questions about academia and roles within, but also how we bump up against the outside world and how we contribute. And Paula, you started us on that path with your remarks. So I'd like to stick with you, if I could, and ask you to talk about, I'll suggest medicine is your background, but if there's some other area that you'd like to talk about in terms of women's leadership as it moves from the academy, from the campuses out into the world, what you see, what has lifted your spirits and what is possibly still dispiriting that we need to work on with some rigor as we move forward.
Yes. Well, I think that, again, just like in these other fields that we've been discussing, there's been progress in medicine. I think Drew alluded, or Susan, to some of the numbers in terms of deans. We're at a point where over 50% of medical students are women. That's fundamentally different than when I went to medical school. And I finished in 1985, and the numbers were far smaller. So we've really made advancements there. Where we've not done as well is in the leadership realm. A bit over 5% of women are full professors in academic medicine. That is really disturbing. And, we've increased the number of deans. So the number, when you get there, you have a greater opportunity to make it to the top. So I think that's the good news. But we still have a tremendous amount of work to do. And again, I'm going to talk about the intersection of race and gender because I think it's so critically important. 3.6% of medical school faculty, 3.6 are Black, and about a little over 1% are Black women. And the numbers are very similar for the Latinx population. So there's something that we are missing or not doing in medicine that we have to really dig down deeply and understand how we open the door to an academic career and make that a pathway that is achievable for both women and people of color in a way that is far more advanced than we do today. Now, you mentioned the report that I co-chaired, and I think part of the issue in medicine is harassment. It's not the only issue, but culture is an issue, and we've done better. But if you look at all the academic STEM fields, medicine, with regard to harassment, is the worst. And it's over 50% of faculty, students, and staff have experienced some form of harassment, sexual harassment, and that includes gender harassment. So, we've got a culture issue. The more you can diversify leadership, that culture changes. But again, when we talk about leadership, it's critical in medicine to look at the fields and disciplines, not unlike the economic story, not unlike computer science or philosophy. You have very much more feminized areas, such as pediatrics, where the opportunities for growth, or OBGYN, certain areas of OBGYN, you cannot compare those to the areas where they are predominantly male: surgery, cardiology, my field, or even within OBGYN, oncology within GYN. So I think that there are many areas that really require an overhaul and a real look at what exclusion looks like, how we change that paradigm, and how we change the culture, and how we make whole populations of people who have the intent to start feel invisible and drop out.
Thank you for that. And, in my mind, I was bridging right to the COVID topic that you raised earlier. Not only are these issues of intersectionality so important for the people who have aspirations and the talent to do something incredible with themselves and their lives, but we also have seen in the pandemic that it has effects on who gets treated and who gets treated well by medical assistants in a pandemic. And so you can, to state the obvious, there is a social responsibility or opportunity that goes with this advancement of women and minorities through the pipeline of talent.
Well, it's a quality of care issue, and it's
Right.
frequently not framed as a quality of care issue, but we cannot have excellence without inclusion, diversity and inclusion. And the quality of care, we know, suffers, and we have data on that. So I
Right.
think there's actually a wonderful perspective piece in this week's New England Journal focused on that. And I think that, it is a matter of quality.
Completely agree. All right, Susan, if you could talk a little bit about, if you wanted to talk about health and neuroscience, where you're spending a lot of your intellectual time these days.
Yeah, thank you, Whitney. Paula has just clearly pointed out something that is quite painful for us, which is that we thought that by achieving equitable representation or better representation among our students and faculty, that would drive change in the things that follow on for our students after they leave our campuses. And I have to say, we have been just dead wrong about that in a number of different ways. And Paul and Drew have called out how well our medical school classes have been more than 50% women for a very long time, decades. Yet when you look at even early roles, we're not talking, and the subsequent leadership roles, it's just not changing as fast as we had dreamed it would have from the original, from our student. So I'm in the midst of a study with my colleagues Sangeeta Bhatia and Nancy Hopkins, and we put together a group to look at one of the things that our faculty and students do beyond the campus, which is tech transfer. MIT's mission is to create technologies that improve the world, and you've actually got to get them out into the world to make those improvements be meaningful. And we had a sense that things were not equitable for women in this domain. And indeed, we've done an analysis. I won't bore you with all the numbers here, but simply to say, when we look at company founding, if we look at funding by venture capital firms of businesses started by women, it is, let's just say, it has not moved at all. Right now, about somewhere less than, well under 5% of venture capital dollars in the United States go to women-founded businesses. But just looking on our own campus, looking at the rate of which companies are founded, we analyzed 7 departments in depth, and let's just say there are disparities. And let me just capture what the consequence of the disparities in women versus men faculty founding businesses are. That within these 7 departments, the disparities are so great that if women had been founding companies at the same rate as men, there would be 40 more companies. 40 more companies. This is crazy. This is in a domain where company founding leads to new medicines, prevents people from dying. And yet even in an area of our economy and health, the benefits of having an equitable contribution by our women as our men would gain for so many people. We have not been getting that done. The response to this, I can talk about this a little more if anyone's interested in it, is to gather together the stakeholders in this domain and really think hard about what we can do to rapidly accelerate possibilities for women to make them equal or approach being equal as they are for men. But the basic lesson is that sadly, the dream that fixing the pipeline would fix the downstream activities has proven to be wrong. And this really does come back to these very deep issues that both Drew and Paula have alluded to, which is that there are unconscious biases, there are all kinds of network effects that still leave our women and our minorities not participating at an equivalent rate to their male peers. And as many of you are probably tired of about, in the greater Boston region, we are the best biohub, the greatest biohub in the world by any number of measures. And it is our responsibility to build a future for medicine that is as equitable as possible, not just for the doing, but also for the recipients of this. And how many studies have we read that demonstrate that having a heterogeneous group work on a problem gets a better result? And somehow those studies have not translated into the kind of diverse workforces that would improve our output. It is very much the way I think about the world, that it's our responsibility to help bring great things into the world that will help all people. And we are not using our resources in a way that would deliver the greatest good on our effort. So I see this, as I said, I've seen this in this world of biotech, biopharma, but one can be assured that it is true well beyond this particular domain. And as I said, I think we owe it not just to our students and our faculty to help even the playing field for participation, but frankly, to deliver on our mission. I think this is something we really need to work on.
Yeah, I think we're hearing, thank you, Susan. I think we're hearing a lot about actually what happens on campus around advancing people with talent who are interested in making the world a better place, makes a difference in the world. And we have more to do on that front. Drew, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about what has either inspired or dispirited you recently. It could be in the field of history or in trends that you are noting as you watch higher education happen from a different vantage point.
Well, as I was listening to Paula and Susan talk about their fields and the direct impact they have on the world, I was thinking about history. How do I think about history in these terms? Because obviously history flourishes in an academic setting. It's not something that we think of necessarily as a part of getting up in the morning and brushing your teeth and eating your meals and all the rest, except that it is. And I think we've seen that in a fundamental way recently. As Paula was speaking, I was thinking about something that she was doing when I first met her, which was probably almost 20 years ago. And she was overturning cardiology by saying, if you use women as subjects for research, you find out a whole different set of realities about cardiology, that they have different symptoms prior to a heart attack, that they present differently, that there is a whole medicine that needs to take into consideration women's bodies as different from men's and not just use men as the default. And I think it was in no small part because of the entrance of people like Paula into that field that those questions started to be asked. And so these fields depend on what questions you ask. And what questions you ask depend in no small part on what questions occur to you based on the life you've led, the experiences you've had, the things you've read, who you are. And in history, this is true as well. And we're seeing a kind of battle right now over our own national history as we come to this moment of racial reckoning in the midst of the pandemic. And what was our history? How did race play a role? How did our history get distorted by the blindnesses that came from not having a wide range of different sorts of eyes looking at our past? And so in many ways, like cardiology, when we bring different people into the conversation, we see different realities. And this is so vividly realized in my mind by the fact that the person who saw, the scholar who saw most clearly the real history of the Civil War and Reconstruction earliest on was W.B. Du Bois. And he was not welcomed into the coterie of professional historians. He was not really listened to in the way that he since has been, and is kind of the leader of saying, this is how we have to understand our history as having been one of exploitation based on the subjugation of Black bodies in slavery, and slavery being a economic engine for the nation as a whole and a defining force in our national politics from the time the nation began. And when we start having our colleagues bring their perspectives, having us challenge one another, we have so much richer an understanding of the past, but also of how that past shapes everything that we do, including the things that Susan and Paula were just speaking about. So history is essential. Just as science and medicine are essential. And the diversification of viewpoints in history is essential as well.
Thank you, Drew. If we ever needed a reminder of how the arts and sciences, how technology, all of these pieces weave together to create the culture and the society and the civilization that we live in, I think we've just had it now. And that's quite wonderful for everyone in the group who's joined us virtually. I'm going to turn to some questions from our audience. And it does look to me like we have, I know a bunch of MIT graduate students, but likely others as well, and junior faculty and people who are making their way in academia. So we'll start with some kind of brass tacks academia questions for those of you who have been through the experience yourself and how. A couple questions on mentoring. Were you mentored by a woman, or did you have positive mentoring experiences and help from either male faculty members or peers as you moved into administration later in the career? How did this work for each of you? And I don't really have a strong sense of who might want to be most eager to answer this question, but Paula, since you talked about medicine being super challenging, perhaps I'll start with you.
Yeah, no, I'd love to begin. And it's such an important question. And it's one that, I think that young people struggle with, because there's this thought of a model of a mentor who's kind of the uber mentor sponsor. And I think that is probably not a good way of thinking about it. But as you go along the way, who are those people who support you, open your eyes to allow you to actually even recognize what is possible, because they recognize it in you? And how do they create and help to foster environments that you can flourish in? And for me, one of my earliest mentors was the first tenured woman in biology at Harvard, and that's Ruth Hubbard. And Ruth was, I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I'm first generation student, came to Harvard, and I took her course called Bio 109, Biology and Women's Issues. And, kind of fast forward, there are so many of us in the field of science related to these issues of sex and gender, who we all took her course. And she impacted so many lives in ways that I don't even think she could fully appreciate. But anyway, I took this course freshman year, and we became, she would have us to her home. It was a very small seminar. And I then took a later course with her, an independent study. And what she enabled in me, first of all, was opening my eyes to a whole nother way of looking at science. Who would have known that 20 some odd years later, that would be my absolute focus and field of study? I never would have imagined, but it started there. And what she did for me, and I really think this is so important, was in a seminar with both Ruth and Stephen Jay Gould, here I was, Paula from Brooklyn, sitting and really thinking through ideas with these two giants. And they might not have, and she might not have realized it, but what it did for me was give me the confidence to say, you believe in my ideas and they are valid. And Ruth and I stayed in touch over the years. And there have been many other mentors, but I focus on her because I don't know if I would have called her necessarily a mentor at the time, but she was a person who opened up doors in many ways. And I'm just going to end the story by saying, fast forward, she passed away in 2016, is either 2000 or early 2017. And there were several of us who spoke at her memorial service. And again, these were colleagues of mine who came together and all reflected on the power of this woman. And it was a woman who was the first tenured biology professor at Harvard. So I just say there are many, many Ruths out there who are transforming lives in ways that they don't even understand. And I think that's the power of being in these positions.
That's a wonderful story. And it may be that for those looking for tips in the chat that I can see, that it's see if you can figure out who the giants around you are and learn from them and become close to them in appropriate ways as you can. Drew or Susan, do you have something to add to the mentor conversation? Drew, go ahead.
I have one thought, which is mentor always seems to me a challenging concept because it's as if you have to find one and that person will save you somehow, and that's going to do it all. And I just want to urge that there are many people who can mentor you, and you should ask them for help, because people mostly like to be asked for help. And once someone's helped you, they're invested in you. Mm-hmm. And that has an ongoing force, or can become an ongoing force. So find many mentors and reach out, because they can stay with you in ways that you may not anticipate.
My colleagues are brilliant. Exactly. So my view of mentors is as many as possible. You are not going to be like anybody. You are going to be like yourself, and you've got to assemble that from advice you get from a number of different people. So, and I love both Drew and Paul said, no one can help unless you ask for it. So you've got to be pretty about, asking for help. I had a fabulous mentor, my graduate advisor, who was, shall we say, unrestrained in criticizing me. And I learned that I had to grow again, because I couldn't hear advice if my feelings were being hurt all the time. And so he helped me understand that, when people said things that were, just felt a little uncomfortable, it was an opportunity. It was hard for me to really get my head around. And, I wish I'd had a woman mentor. I did not have that. But when I was at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, I got to know Barbara, just an incredible giant, an early biologist who was frankly treated quite badly. She won the Nobel Prize while I was at the lab, and it was on Columbus Day. So the only people at the lab were the scientists. We all went to her press conference. And this was one of the most inspiring moments of my life. The reporters were, every single reporter asked you the same question. weren't you mad that no one recognized you? Aren't you angry that this happened to you? And the questions were all the same, and she kept saying no. She just, kind of, I remember putting her hands on the table, heaving a big sigh, and saying, when you know you're right, it doesn't matter what anyone thinks. Which for me was, I mean, who would have imagined you could feel that way about yourself in the world? But it was just so inspiring. And I think, unfortunately, these adults and, getting into battle and just kind of pushing your way, and I think is very important. And I think, frankly, men learn to do that by playing sports. Something we learn to be polite. And I just love this idea of just asking the questions that you have, finding people to ask, and, using their answers as you can form your world that's going to be different from anyone else's, but definitely as many mentors as possible. And don't hesitate to ask, because people, as you says, people love to be asked for advice. And once they've advised, they want to know how you're doing.
Whitney, can I just add one thing to what Susan and Drew have said, which is that looking for support and mentoring in many is important. And there are different types of mentoring. I mean, there's the issues around your career. These are issues around, I think in particular for women, the integration of work and family. So many issues. For me, there's the integration of race into that, and who can help you navigate these multiple dimensions. And I think that is where I always use this analogy of a quilt, right? This mentoring quilt that you create. And the only other end point I want to make is that for the graduate students who are here in the audience, that as you climb, you must look behind you, because, my rule of thumb is that there's always time, because it doesn't take much time to talk to somebody who is asking for input, because you really never know what impact that will have on a person. And our graduate students have tremendous power as well to impact the lives of the undergraduates and others who are in their labs. So just lots to think about.
Fabulous. Thank you all three for that generous sharing of your own experiences, and also the encouragement that the Academy wants to help approach the community and ask for support and input, which is great. This kind of gets us back to, there are a couple of questions about tokenism, if you will, for women, whether people who are hired and then hear from their colleagues, sometimes it looks like from their male colleagues, you only received this offer because you're a woman, or the department is trying to head in X direction or Y direction. Out in the larger society, there's certainly a conversation about board membership and diversity of opinion and inclusion of women. I wonder if you would each comment on how, if you've encountered it, how you handle it, or how you would advise people handle it now in the 21st century when they encounter this kind of response. Susan, I wonder if you'd like to start.
Yeah, it's easy to be distracted by these intended or non-intended put downs or discounting. And I think in general, your reflex is to, push back. And I have found the most useful approach to this is just to put your head down and do your job, so that it can't be your job to counter every insult, and it can't be, obviously it hurts. But the more wasted in feeling badly about some put down that I haven't put to accomplishing the goal. And I think one of the things that has me is having a few close friends in whom I can confide my frustration. But I had, it was actually the husband of my assistant when I became dean of the graduate school, who I was going off to engage in what I knew was going to be a very difficult confrontation. And his advice as I left the office was, just keep smiling. It makes them crazy. And that was perhaps the best advice I've ever gotten. Just, stay focused on the job, because there will always be people who will be less kind than you'd like them to be. And it's very hard to stop that. But I think that, this whole business, I think part of the problem is that there's a lack of awareness of what these discounts mean and, how they're read. And I just think it's very difficult for each of us to take these things on as individuals.
That's great. And thoughtful. Drew, do you want to add anything to that thought about, do you have a place here?
Well, one of the things that should go through a person's mind if she is told that she's there as a token is just, and how did you get here? What kinds of advantages did you ride to this position that you're holding from which you're criticizing me? I think I followed Susan's rules more or less. I didn't confront people on these matters. I instead tried to do my job and disprove them. But often I would say to myself, and I think I convinced myself, they have it wrong. And that was helpful. But I want to go back to something I think Susan said earlier when she said that the pipeline is not solving things, that just having more women qualified for jobs or qualified for positions, or half of women in medical school, half of students in medical school being women, or whatever the numbers might be, that's not solving it. We need to be affirmative in our commitments and our actions to advancing women and advancing people of color. And that means sometimes putting people in jobs in a very determined way and saying we've got to have more points of view in this group. We've got to have people represented on this committee who aren't all of the same background and identity. And so if that turns out to be tokenism, I say tokenism is a great word, because that's how you're going to have effective organizations and how you're going to break through this wall that has made itself evident and that Susan described, of just because there are people there doesn't mean that they're necessarily moving into the positions of leadership and influence in which we need them so desperately.
Well, that's right. A token can be a treasure or a talisman or a marker of something important. And I like that meaning, filling that.
Can I say one thing though? It ought to go beyond token. We ought to not just say, okay, here's one. And insofar as token means just stick somebody in there, that's not good enough. It means has to be many.
Very good. Paula, anything you'd like to?
The only thing I would add very briefly is that we're still in a time when intentionality regarding how we, if you are able to put people in positions, how we think about putting people in positions in order to get a diversity of thought, diversity in leadership, which we know is essential for excellence. And until we're beyond that, we're going to be grappling with these questions. And again, I think there's some real work to be done when we put people in positions to really stress that they belong and create the environment that actually makes them believe, yes, this is important. And I'm just going to say something that, this is not just true in environments that are fully male dominated. This is true in every environment. We have, as I said, 52% women faculty, but I am very intentional on really thinking about women and grooming women for leadership roles. The dominant culture still prevails. And I think we really, we still have to be intentional across the board.
Can I just add something? Because I think there's something that each of us can do, and I've done this sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. It is natural to, find the women, hang out with women, but to identify one of the men, in a group join, and basically adopt that man as your partner in effort can be enormously helpful for him and also for you. And so I think the tokenism, the kind of siloization, it is our responsibility, I think, to break those silos down and to do it quite intentionally, to find someone who you imagine is sympathetic or could be sympathetic. And just to go over, for example, I've joined boards and, to find not just the women on the boards, but also the men from whom I can learn and who will kind of become my best friend on that board. And it just has made a huge difference of, my scope of understanding. And I think it helps you of people who would be some, men who might be sitting off in their separatist organization.
They might just need to be asked. I think you're right.
Yeah.
Some other sort of practical issues that are coming up in the questions, decisions women academics particularly are grappling with. There's the choice between work and family or family support, and are there things that you see as trends that you'd like to see pushed faster and farther that would support female academics in balancing those issues and actually support the whole community in being able to manage work-life balance issues. And somewhat related to that, or we'll just weave it together, questions choosing between leadership and research. And you make different choices in part based on the kind of life you want to live, but people are interested in how you made the choice. Was it a choice? Were you able to keep your research going? And what kind of support did you have, or would you recommend, or do you think we should offer in the background to allow women faculty to make those choices freely?
Could I say something that's a kind of an oblique angle to what you just asked, but we're coming close to the end of our time, and I want to make sure this subject is introduced. And that is, as we think about work-life balance, what the heck is it going to mean for all of us to see what COVID has done? And the women being pushed out of the workforce, the enormous burdens that have been put on women with children in the past year plus, graduate student progress, assistant professors, people who may decide, are you kidding? You want me to be on a committee? There's no way I can do one more thing. And so how do we think about the questions you're asking of work-life balance in terms of the torpedo that COVID has represented in that already very difficult mix of things?
That's great. Let's move with that as the context for these, choices that are really real for the community we're talking about here. Thank you for getting us started in that direction, Drew. Susan, do you want to speak?
Yeah, I think, boy, this is so complicated, and this has been shall we say, a truth-telling year. So embedded in this question of stepping into a larger role, let me tell my story in brief. I had no intention of moving into leadership because I was a scientist and it was what I did and who I and was never imagined doing this. And when Rick Levin invited me to be dean of the graduate school, I had a kind of, an awakening that I had had an extraordinary career and extraordinary privileges because someone had been running the universities that I had participated in. And I said, wow, I've really time for me to step up. I'll do it for 3 years and then I'm going to go back to lab. But just feeling that it was a call to service, and obviously I never went back to lab. But the reason I could do that was because my husband stepped up and said, our daughter was 6 at the time, and I'm a married parent. I mean, if she had not been in school, guess who would have been home taking care of her? And he stepped up and said, change my practice. He's a neurologist and in a very demanding practice. I'm going to change my practice basically so I can be primary parent. And it's that kind of responsibilities that rarely happens for a lot of reasons, but it has to happen more. And frankly, I do believe employers have a responsibility to provide the kind of support that families need so that men and women can more equally in responsibilities of a family. And obviously, when that support structure shuts down because of COVID, we're back in the '84 where guess who does the majority of the work? It is the women. So I think it's not that my husband and I had the conversation before we got married or before we decided to be pregnant, but happily my husband had the wisdom to recognize what my taking on this new role would mean to our family. So These are tough, tough issues. They're deeply societal, and we need to face them head on. And Drew, thank you for raising this, because I am terrified about the long-term consequences of, let's just say it's only a year, but a year of so many women basically stepping back from the workforce or working at whatever it is you can manage while doing all this other stuff, and the consequences on those careers. And I'm just afraid of the progress that we've seen, really quite dramatically.
So I'll just jump in. I mean, I think that, I'm not going to focus on kind of my own decision making, but I think to focus on how are we going to move forward, because I do think that COVID has created a situation that is dire. The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine just produced a report on the potential impact on young scientists and faculty, women, in STEM fields. And I would say that, it's beyond STEM, but this particular report focused on STEM. And I think that we are here at Wellesley thinking very deeply about the kind of 360 that we have to approach to how we have to think about how do we get our scientists back on track. And we haven't figured it all out, but I think some of this is going to have to do with additional support to kind of reboot the work. Some of this we're going to, there's obviously the piece on the tenure clock. That part is almost an easier decision, but you have to then think about what are the ramifications of delays on the tenure clock and how do we address those. We can't remedy everything, but I do think it's our responsibility to think about what can we do, and then what are the consequences, the unintended consequences of that. And then I think we have to really get to some of the federal funding agencies to really begin to discuss how are we going to deal with grants. No cost extensions are not the answer here. Faculty have lost serious time, and how do we use our power to work with our agencies to really come up with potential other strategies that are not just about, again, a no cost extension, which is really a non-answer. It's part of the answer, but it's not really the answer. So lots to think about here. I know that we are thinking actively with colleagues. I've been in touch with the Harvard leadership as well as with the MIT leadership. And these are really burning questions. So we're on the path, but we have a long way to go. And we are going to have to really continue to understand and measure kind of what it is we're trying to do here and what the impact is of some of those solutions. So there isn't an answer, but we do have to recognize the impact of this pandemic, which has been devastating on women in so many ways, economically, health-wise, but in this career, and it's all careers have really experienced this.
This has been an incredible discussion. Drew, I want to give you a chance to have one last word if you want on the COVID topic. And
no last word from me. I'm just really pleased to have heard from my colleagues on something that I think is a burning issue in so many ways, but in terms of women and careers and academia, I think it will be, as Paula says, or should be, a central concern for all of us in the years to come. So thank you, Susan and Paula, for your insights on this.
And so we are approaching time. And so I just want to say, wow, the MIT alumni and alumnae are proud to have been a moving agent in bringing this incredible group of women leaders and thought leaders together to share not only sharp and savvy, but also very human observations about what it's like to move through the academy today, what the opportunities are for our campuses to touch the world in positive ways, and the work yet to be done, as Susan called it, the network effects that need continued tending and pushing and fostering. And so I just want to thank everybody who joined us virtually, and to let you know that your questions are in the chat and we will share them with our speakers so they can know even more what the tenor of the curiosity was. And I just want to let you know that the video should be up on the MIT Alumni Association YouTube channel in less than a week. So if there are people that you want to share it with, or a section you want to watch again, it's there. Presidents and Presidents Emerita, thank you so much for spending your time with us. And with that, we will sign off. Thank you all.
Thank you, Whitney.
Whitney, thank you, Susan.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.